The cabin sat where the tree line thickened into an uninvited darkness, the kind that swallowed sound and light as if the world ended just a few steps further in. People in the nearby Ohio town avoided that place the same way animals avoid a trap they can't see but somehow sense is waiting. Yet when the census taker knocked on the crooked wooden door in the summer of 1914, the old man answered with a steadiness that made the visitor's breath hitch. His back was bent, his clothes were worn to threads, but his eyes, those impossible eyes, shone with a clarity that didn't belong to someone of his claimed age. He said he was 126 years old, born into slavery before the century had even turned, and he spoke it not with pride, nor with fragility, but with a tone that suggested every year had been etched into him with something sharper than time. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rusted chains left too long in the rain. Photographs lay scattered on the table, each one showing a different decade, but the same man staring out with the same expression, unchanged except for the deepening shadow in his gaze. When the census taker asked how this could be possible, the old man did not laugh or dismiss the question. Instead, he turned toward the dark of the forest outside and said quietly, "Time doesn't heal everything. Sometimes, it just follows you." The wind pushed against the cabin walls then, groaning like something alive. The old man's shoulders tightened, his eyes tracking something only he could see moving between the trees. He spoke again, but softer this time, almost to himself. "I lived longer than any man should. Not because I wanted to, but because it wouldn't let me go." A chill crawled up the visitor's spine, and he felt, without understanding why, that he was no longer alone in the room, that something unseen was listening from the corners where the light didn't reach. The old man's breath shook as he leaned forward, the lamplight flickering between them, casting shadows that stretched too far across the floor. "If you write my name down," he whispered, "make sure you don't write the other one. The one they gave it. The one I never asked for." But before the census taker could ask what he meant, a low sound drifted from the trees outside, a slow, dragging growl that didn't belong to any animal he knew. The old man's face drained of color, and for the first time that night, fear, not age, made his hands tremble. The lamp flickered. The growl grew closer. And the visitor realized, with sudden clarity, that the man's long life wasn't a blessing or a miracle. It was a warning. The discovery of the old man began on a heavy summer afternoon when the sun hung low over the Ohio fields, turning the air thick enough to taste and making even the insects move slower than usual. A young census taker, new to his government post and eager to prove himself, followed a dirt path he had been warned not to bother with, a path most locals claimed led nowhere except to an abandoned stretch of forest where the trees grew too close together and the wind carried strange echoes. But duty demanded accuracy, and the last known map insisted that a single occupant still resided at the end of that forgotten trail, so he pressed on until the path narrowed into little more than a tunnel of roots and shadows. When the cabin finally came into view, it sat slanted and exhausted, its boards grayed by time and its roof bowed like an old man forced into submission, yet faint smoke curling from the chimney suggested someone within still clung to life. The census taker approached carefully, unsure whether he'd find an elderly recluse or perhaps no one at all, but when he knocked, the door opened with a slow creak that felt almost intentional, and the man who stood before him looked like he had stepped out of another century entirely. His face was lined not with simple age but with something denser, as if each year had carved a deep history into his skin. His posture, though bent, radiated a strange steadiness, and his eyes held a sharp, haunting awareness that made the visitor lower his voice without knowing why. The man introduced himself plainly, his voice steady but touched by a weariness that seemed older than language itself, and when he claimed to be 126 years old, he did so without a hint of exaggeration or confusion, as though the number held no more importance than the day of the week. Inside the cabin, everything felt out of place with time, objects from different eras lay scattered without order, and the air carried an odor that suggested moisture, soil, and something faintly metallic, like rust worn into memory. The census taker wrote down the man's information with slow, deliberate strokes, but as he listened to the unbroken clarity of the old man's speech and studied the unchanging sharpness of his gaze, he felt a quiet dread creeping into his thoughts, a growing sense that he had not simply found an elderly survivor of a harsh life but someone who had endured far more years and far more horrors than any human body was meant to hold. And as the forest outside rustled with a sound that didn't quite belong to the wind, The visitor realized the true discovery wasn't the man's age but the unsettling awareness that something else had been waiting with him in that forgotten cabin in the woods. When local officials began reviewing the old man's claims, they expected to find nothing more than the usual confusion that came with age, perhaps a misremembered birth year or a clerical error buried somewhere in the state's dusty archives. But the deeper they searched, the more unsettling the coincidences became, until what started as routine verification unraveled into a tangle of records that seemed to stretch impossibly far back. A clerk in the county office was the first to notice that the man's name appeared in an 1840 plantation ledger from Virginia, listed among a group of enslaved workers with ages beside their names. At first, she assumed it had to be a relative, a father or grandfather with the same name, yet the handwriting, the details, and a strange set of notes in the margins suggested otherwise. The man described in those records matched the old man in Ohio not just by name but by scars noted on the body, scars that the census taker had already reported seeing. Curiosity quickly turned into unease as officials dug further, tracing the name through different plantations, sale documents, and medical notes written by overseers who described a quiet worker with an uncanny endurance for exhaustion and injury. The handwriting in each set of documents differed, the ink faded in different ways, but the physical description remained eerily consistent across decades, too precise to be coincidence. A historian consulted by the county office pointed out another troubling detail. The final record from Virginia placed the man at an age that would already have made him unusually old for the period, yet the handwriting in the ledger lacked any suggestion that the overseer found this strange. It was as though those who had written the records were unaware that the numbers didn't add up, or perhaps had chosen not to question it. More troubling still was the discovery of a small bundle of preserved documents tucked inside the plantation archives, a page describing an incident involving the same man during an unexplained event on the estate, something the overseer described as a night of impossible sounds. The report ended abruptly, as though someone had torn out a portion of the narrative. The county officials, now far beyond the bounds of their simple fact-checking task, found themselves piecing together fragments of a life that defied normal chronology, each document confirming the man's existence in eras separated by wars, migrations, and generations long gone. With each new discovery, it became harder to dismiss the impossible idea that the man living alone in the Ohio woods was the same individual recorded in those 19th-century documents, unchanged in description, unmoved by time, and carrying a timeline that should have ended long before any of them were born, yet somehow continuing as if the decades themselves had been forced to make room for him. Whispers about the old man's age had circulated long before any official ever stepped onto his property, because the townspeople who lived closest to that stretch of forest carried memories that didn't align with normal human lifespans. Some of the oldest residents recalled seeing him when they were small children, back when the town itself was still forming, yet they insisted, with genuine certainty, that he looked then exactly as he did now. Not similar, not reminiscent, but identical in a way that left them uneasy when they spoke of it, as though remembering too much might stir something better left forgotten. One shopkeeper, who had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories, claimed that the old woman once described delivering bread to the same man during a harsh winter many decades earlier. According to her grandmother, he had opened the door of that same crooked cabin, standing with the same bent posture but with eyes just as sharp as the census taker had described, and though the grandmother had been a child at the time, she never forgot how old he looked, old in a way that felt impossible even then. Now, almost 70 years later, her granddaughter was seeing that same face unchanged by time. The tales grew stranger the more people felt compelled to share them. A farmer who lived near the woods insisted that when he was a boy, his father warned him never to wander past the outer fields because the man in the cabin didn't age like normal folks, and that kind of thing meant he was carrying something that didn't belong to the world of ordinary men. Another recalled a faded photograph found in his family's attic, a group portrait taken in the late 1800s during a town gathering, and among the faces was a figure standing off to the side, half in shadow, tall, gaunt, with those unmistakable eyes. The family had laughed it off as coincidence, a resemblance passed down through bloodlines, until a recent visitor pointed out that the man in the photograph bore not the likeness of a relative, but the exact bone structure, the exact tilt of the head, the exact stillness that the current old man possessed. These recollections, distant yet strangely precise, hinted at a presence that had lingered through generations without shifting, a life preserved in a way no natural force could explain. What unsettled the townspeople most wasn't simply that he appeared unchanged, but that no one could remember a time when he looked younger. There were no recollections of him as a man in his 40s or 50s, no memories of him ever growing into old age, only memories of him already old, already burdened, already carrying a silent, watchful heaviness that had followed him through the decades. And as each new witness stepped forward, sharing stories that lined up with uncanny precision, a quiet fear settled in the town. The old man hadn't merely lived a long time, he had lived outside of time, untouched by the years that shaped every other life around him. The discovery of the old man's journal happened by accident, though the moment it was found, every person in that cabin felt an instinctive chill, as though they had disturbed something that had been deliberately hidden for far too long. When the authorities entered after the census report raised concerns, they expected to find only the remnants of a solitary life, old tools, scraps of food, piles of clothing too worn to salvage. But beneath a loose floorboard near the man's cot lay a leather-bound book so worn it looked as if it had been handled by 100 different hands across 100 different years. Its cover was scarred, cracked at the spine, and strangely warm to the touch, as if the pages inside still held the heat of a long-forgotten sun. The first few entries appeared in plain, careful English, simple notes about weather, harvest seasons, moments of work and exhaustion typical of a life carved from hardship. But as the investigators turned the pages, the writing shifted, slowly at first, then abruptly, into a mixture of English and an unfamiliar dialect that none of them recognized, a language that seemed to twist mid-sentence, blending words from various origins into phrases that made the reader's eyes ache. What struck them even harder was the content. Some entries described events that should have been impossible, recounting days and nights on plantations that matched historical records yet were written with a clarity suggesting the writer had lived through them far more recently than the dates implied. Other passages were filled with strange observations about the woods, about shadows that moved without wind, about nights when the moon turned a color no one else remembered seeing. One section in particular described a night on the plantation when something approached from the tree line, something neither animal nor human, something that left deep claw marks in the dirt and a constant ringing in the ears of those who survived. The overseer's report found earlier in the archives had hinted at such a night, but the journal detailed it with terrifying intimacy, as though the writer had been inches away from whatever had come crawling out of the darkness. Even more unsettling were the pages where the handwriting changed entirely, slanted, frantic, looping in erratic circles as if written by a hand shaking with fear. These entries mentioned a name, though the ink had smeared so violently it was impossible to decipher it fully, only that it began with a harsh, angular letter and repeated several times as though invoking or warding off something. The final entries grew quieter, almost resigned, speaking of a presence that followed the writer from Virginia to Ohio, a presence that waited just beyond the tree line, never aging, never stopping, and never letting him die. And as the officials closed the journal with trembling hands, the silence in the cabin felt suddenly heavier, as if the book itself had been breathing, and now that it was awake, the air didn't quite belong to them anymore. The warning came on a night when the sky darkened in a way no one in the town could explain, as if the world were holding its breath in anticipation of something older than memory. The old man had been seen earlier that day walking the edge of the woods with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes constantly drifting upward toward the reddening moon that had begun its eerie ascent long before dusk. Those who passed him on the road said he looked different, not older, not weaker, but unusually alert, as though listening to something distant and approaching, something only he could hear. By evening, the sheriff received a message from one of the neighbors who lived a mile from the cabin, saying the old man had appeared at his door without knocking, standing silent until the door opened, then uttering a single sentence that drained the color from the homeowner's face, "It's coming again." The sheriff, unsure whether the old man was delirious or in danger, followed the dirt trail back to the isolated cabin. As he approached, the light from the red-tinted moon threw strange shadows across the trees, stretching them in unnatural shapes that seemed to sway without the breeze. When he pushed open the cabin door, he found the old man sitting rigidly in his wooden chair, hands gripping the armrests as though bracing himself against an invisible force. The room felt colder than the air outside, and the sheriff sensed a quiet tension radiating from the walls, as if the cabin itself were listening to their every breath. The old man didn't immediately look at him. Instead, he stared through the window toward the dark forest, murmuring words the sheriff couldn't make out. When he finally turned his gaze toward the visitor, His eyes held a fear far deeper than anything the sheriff had ever seen, a fear that came not from confusion or madness but recognition. Without being asked, the old man spoke of a night decades earlier, back on the plantation, when the moon had turned the same shade of red. He described screams echoing from the fields, the sound of something large pushing through the sugarcane, the way the ground vibrated beneath bare feet. He said the overseers had tried to keep it secret, but everyone who survived that night carried the memory like a brand burned beneath their skin. It was the same presence he had felt haunting him through the years, the same presence he had written about in his journal, something that had followed him north and waited in the outskirts of every place he tried to settle. The sheriff tried to reassure him, but before he could speak, a low howl rose from deep within the woods, not the cry of a wolf or coyote, but a dragging, gurgling sound that resonated through the cabin floor. The old man shut his eyes tightly, whispering that it always came when the moon turned red, always searching, always hungry, and that no matter how far he ran or how many years passed, it would never stop hunting what it had marked. The disappearance of the historian began with routine professionalism and ended with a silence so complete it clung to every person who listened to her last recorded words. She had arrived in town with confidence, armed with notebooks, a tape recorder, and the calm skepticism of someone who had spent years debunking local legends. To her, the claims surrounding the old man were nothing more than folklore dressed up as fact, stories stretched by memory, fear, and the natural erosion of truth over time. But her certainty began to waver the moment she stepped inside the cabin. She noted the unnatural cold lingering in the corners, the strange arrangement of objects that seemed purposeful yet impossible to decipher, and the journal whose pages carried unfamiliar symbols that made her fingers tremble when she traced them. Still, she pressed on with her interview, her voice steady at first as she asked the old man about his life, the plantations, and the strange events described in those fading documents. But as the night grew deeper, so did his answers, shifting from historical detail to fragmented warnings that made her pause more often than she intended. Her final tape recording began with the soft scratch of her adjusting the microphone, followed by her stating the date and time in a firm, controlled tone. She asked a question about the night of the blood moon, and the old man replied with a whisper so faint she had to repeat her question twice before he spoke more clearly. What he said next came out in a shaking voice, that something had followed him for more than a century, something that moved through shadows like a living wound, something that had no face except the one it borrowed from the darkness around it. The historian's breathing quickened on the tape, but she tried to maintain professionalism, urging him to continue. The old man told her to stop writing, to stop recording, to stop listening, saying every retelling made it stronger because it fed on memory like a parasite. The last coherent part of the tape captured the low creak of the cabin door, followed by the old man whispering, "It knows you're here." What came next was a sound no one who listened to the tape could explain. A dragging noise, as if something heavy moved across the wooden floor, followed by a faint choking gasp from the historian. Her chair scraped the ground, and her hurried footsteps echoed as she backed away. She muttered that something was standing in the doorway, something she could see even though the room was unlit. Then the recorder captured a single, trembling sentence, "It's not shaped like anything living." After that, the tape dissolved into static. When authorities arrived hours later, the cabin was empty. The old man was gone. The historian's recorder was found in the dirt outside, still warm, still running, but she herself had vanished without leaving a single footprint behind, as though the darkness had simply opened and swallowed her whole. When authorities returned to the cabin after the historian's disappearance, they approached it with a caution that bordered on fear, their footsteps heavy on the dirt path as if each step might wake something lurking just below the surface. The cabin looked unchanged from the outside, but once they crossed the threshold, the air felt different, darker, heavier, carrying a faint vibration like a distant hum beneath the floorboards. They searched the single room thoroughly, overturning blankets, shifting furniture, and scanning the corners where the shadows seemed thicker than they should have been. For a long while, the cabin revealed nothing, offering only the silence of a place that seemed too eager to keep its secrets. But then one of the deputies noticed a section of the floor where the boards didn't align perfectly, a subtle unevenness that suggested tampering. When he pressed down, the wood shifted, and a muted thud echoed beneath their feet. With crowbars and cautious hands, they pried the boards loose, revealing a narrow opening that led to a hidden chamber below. A cold breath of air rose from it, carrying the smell of soil and something older, metallic, stale, and faintly sweet. The deputies descended a wooden ladder worn smooth by years of use, each rung creaking under their weight. The chamber was larger than expected, dug deep into the earth, its walls reinforced with timbers so old they turned the color of ash. Lanterns illuminated a scene that made every man hesitate before stepping further. The room was filled with artifacts from different centuries, arranged in careful lines and piles that suggested ritual rather than storage. There were rusted plantation tools beside iron shackles broken long ago, cracked ceramic bowls, hand-carved figures with faces obscured or scratched out, and scraps of clothing that seemed impossibly preserved. But the most unsettling discovery lay at the center of the room. The dirt floor was carved with symbols, circles intersected by jagged lines, shapes reminiscent of both African spiritual markings and something darker, something less human. These carvings were precise, deep, and fresh, as though someone had been tending them regularly. Some of the symbols glowed faintly in the lantern light, not with brightness but with an oily sheen that made the deputies take a step back. On the far wall, claw marks raked across the packed earth, impossibly deep for any human hand, as if something with immense strength had tried to claw its way out or perhaps claw its way in. One deputy brushed his gloved fingers across the grooves, only to recoil when he realized the edges were warm. As they continued inspecting the room, they noticed something else, an indentation in the dirt where someone had clearly been sitting or sleeping, but the impression was elongated, not matching the shape of a human body. It ran too long, too narrow, tapering at one end like the drag of a tail or the imprint of something that slithered instead of walked. Every man in that chamber felt the same cold certainty settling into his bones. The old man had been waiting down here, not hiding from the world above, but from something that visited him in this room, something he had tried to bind or contain with symbols, something he had lived with for far too many years. And the disturbing truth was clear: the chamber was not a shelter, but a cage, built not to keep the old man safe, but to keep something else from following him back up into the world. The testimony of the elderly woman emerged only after the town realized the old man and the historian were never coming back. She lived in a weathered brick house on the outskirts, a place where the curtains stayed drawn and the porch sat empty no matter the hour. Most people assumed age had taken her memory, but when the sheriff visited to ask what she might know, something in her face shifted, as though she had been waiting decades for someone to finally ask the right question. At first, she refused to speak, shaking her head with a distant fear that had never faded, but when she saw the old man's journal in the sheriff's hands, she inhaled sharply and whispered that she had known him once, long before the rest of the town had even been born. Her voice trembled as she explained that she had met him when she was only 8 years old, back when her parents moved into a small house near the woods, a house that no longer stood. On her first night there, she had wandered off chasing fireflies and found herself at the edge of his property. She remembered the cabin clearly. It looked old even then, as if it had been abandoned for years. But when the door opened, the man who stepped out was the same man they were all searching for now, same posture, same weary eyes, same lines etched into his skin. He looked ancient, impossibly ancient, even though that memory belonged to a girl who was now nearly 90. She said he hadn't spoken much during that first encounter, only looked at her with a sadness she didn't understand at the time. He gently told her to go home before dark because the woods changed when the sun fell. She didn't listen. A week later she ventured out again, and that time she saw something moving behind the cabin, something that slithered between the trees without breaking a single branch. She couldn't describe it fully even now, she only remembered the sensation of being watched by something that didn't blink, didn't breathe, and didn't belong in the world she understood. The old man had appeared suddenly, grabbing her hand and dragging her back toward the path, whispering urgently that she must never return after dusk. She recalled his grip was strong, too strong for someone who looked so frail. When she told her parents what happened, they dismissed it as a child's imagination, but the memory remained carved into her mind with a clarity that frightened her even now. Years later, when she passed by that same cabin as a young woman, she noticed something even stranger. The old man hadn't changed at all. Not a wrinkle, not a strand of hair out of place. He was frozen in the same age she remembered from childhood, as though time moved around him rather than through him. She kept this to herself, afraid of what people would think, but deep down she believed the truth that others only whispered about. Whatever haunted him had preserved him, kept him alive long after nature should have reclaimed him. and as she recounted these memories, her hands shook violently, for she believed that by speaking of him again, she had invited that unseen presence back into her life, and she could feel it listening, waiting, just as it had all those years ago. When word finally spread that the old man had died, the announcement carried an unnatural heaviness, as if the town itself didn't quite believe it. 4 years, he had outlived every expectation, every logical explanation, every boundary that defined what a human life should be. So when a pair of hunters found his body deep within the forest, lying at the base of a hollowed tree with his eyes closed and hands folded across his chest, the discovery felt less like the end of a life and more like the breaking of some long-held tension. At first glance, he looked peaceful, almost relieved, as if he had finally been granted permission to rest. The hunters described a strange warmth in the air around him, despite the crisp morning cold, and an unsettling quiet that swallowed the woods as they approached. No birds, no insects, nothing but the soft rustle of leaves, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. They alerted the authorities, who arrived quickly, curious and wary, unsure what they might find. The coroner prepared to transport the body, but something about the old man's skin gave him pause. It felt fragile, not like the natural fragility of an elderly body, but brittle, as though the slightest pressure might cause it to crumble. Within minutes of being moved, the first signs of decay began. At first, it was subtle, a darkening around the fingertips and temples, but it spread with a speed that made those present stare in disbelief. His skin tightened, then cracked, releasing a faint, dry odor that reminded the sheriff of old paper left too long in the sun. By the time they laid him on the stretcher, his body had begun collapsing inward, the bones losing shape, the skin sinking into itself as though decades of deterioration were unfolding in moments. The coroner tried to halt the process, thinking perhaps it was a reaction to cold or moisture, but the body continued to deteriorate right before their eyes. Within an hour, what remained of the old man had turned to something like ash, fine, grey, and strangely warm to the touch. The transformation was so complete that there was nothing left resembling a human form, only a small mound of dust where a man who had lived for more than a century had once lain. The sheriff insisted on collecting the remains, but when he touched them, the ash dissolved further, drifting through his fingers like smoke. One deputy swore he saw the ash shiver, as if responding to movement or breath, but the others dismissed it as imagination. Still, none of them forgot the way the forest reacted afterward. The wind rose suddenly, spiraling around the clearing, lifting the last fragments of the old man into the air until they vanished in a thin, trembling cloud. What unsettled the town most wasn't merely the unnatural decay but the sense that something had been released, something that had been tethered to him for far too long. Some claimed the woods felt different in the days that followed, heavier, more watchful. Others said they heard low, dragging sounds after dark, sounds that reminded them of the old stories whispered about the thing that followed him. And though no one dared say it aloud, a quiet dread settled in every heart that knew the truth. The old man hadn't simply died, he had been unbound, and whatever he had spent his life containing was no longer forced to follow him, it was finally free. Here is the 450-word explanation of key point number 10, with ***, no subheadings and no ending sentence ***. As modern historians sift through the fragments of Silas's life, they are confronted with a set of contradictions so profound that they seem designed to taunt anyone attempting to impose logic on them. His lifespan alone would be enough to draw attention, but it is the details recorded in government archives, personal journals, and oral histories that create a puzzle far more disturbing. Historians expected to find the usual inconsistencies that come with old records, yet instead they found a series of impossibilities, documents separated by decades confirming the same name, the same physical description, and the same background, appearing long after any other person born in his era would reasonably still be alive. Some tried to dismiss it as mistaken identity, but the handwriting matches, the signatures are identical, and even the accounts of people who met him at different times describe features too distinctive to be confused with another man. Silas was remembered for an unusual pattern in his irises, a faint ring that looked almost metallic, and multiple eyewitnesses across nearly a century described it the same way. The more researchers dug, the stranger the timeline became. Silas appeared in unexpected places, county borders, isolated farms, abandoned plantations, always at moments when something inexplicable had just happened. Livestock found dead without visible wounds, families moving away overnight without explanation, children waking up screaming about the man who watches from the tree line. There was no proof that Silas was involved, yet his presence threaded through these odd events too consistently to ignore. Historians compiling the cases realized that every cluster of reports had one thing in common: Silas arrived shortly before, and he vanished shortly after. Attempts to frame him as a superstitious scapegoat fall apart when researchers uncover accounts from rational observers, including doctors, teachers, and military officers, who wrote about him in matter-of-fact tones, describing him as polite, calm, and yet somehow unsettling in a way they couldn't articulate. Even more unnerving is the impression that Silas anticipated investigators long before they would ever exist. A handful of objects discovered in the houses he briefly occupied seemed deliberately placed, like clues or warnings. One historian found a sketch of a river bend that hadn't existed since the 1700s because the landscape had shifted. Another uncovered an old brass token etched with a phrase from an African dialect nearly extinct by Silas's time. They were breadcrumbs, but breadcrumbs leading backward instead of forward, pointing to a past even he never spoke about. Researchers found themselves facing the chilling possibility that Silas wasn't trying to be remembered but trying to be understood, leaving fragments as if hoping one day someone would decipher what he himself could no longer explain. Each discovery suggests that the mystery around him was not accidental but intentional, fashioned by a man who moved through history like a shadow, quietly aware that the truth of his existence was far stranger than anyone living could comfortably accept.